you don't have it already. And then in the meantime, I'm going to just talk about the objectives here. Just kind of go over what we're going to be doing today. So we've kind of got 3 different, somewhat unrelated objectives here. And so we're just kind of putting them all together into one kind of larger project. So we're going to be talking about alert controllers, which are something that you see very, very often in iOS. And even yesterday I was talking about, when we were talking about the do, try, catch, and showing some alert to a user to actually let them know maybe why something didn't work, you generally would do that with like an alert controller. So you'll know how to do that by the end of today. We'll be talking about picker views as well. So you guys have seen picker views. Let me pull this up so we can kind of have an example. This is the app that we're building today. It's a countdown timer, but a picker view would be like this, where you're able to run through and just kind of pick things, right? The cool part about these picker views here is we are able to completely choose what goes in here. There is a what's called a date picker, which is specifically for dates that's kind of pre-made, but you're also able to put in whatever you want. So if you wanted to choose from locations, or like we have here, time, or a bunch of options for whatever. I mean, you even see this in like in Safari, right? When a website would have a drop down, it just puts it into a picker view. So they're very customizable, and it's a really great way for letting a user kind of go through a bunch of options that they could have in iOS, because we don't have any sort of built-in functionality for like a drop-down menu per se. So this is kind of the alternative. And then we have timers. So obviously this is a countdown timer. So if I run this for like 5 seconds here, it's going to count down here. So we'll be talking about timers, and they're not necessarily just used when you want to do something like this, like count down, but timers are used kind of all over the place to just let you, do something every X amount of seconds, or after waiting X amount of seconds. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be sort of like a visual thing to the user per se. So that's kind of what we're going to be going towards today, is just talking about timers, picker views, and alert controllers, and we'll be doing it through this. Oh, sorry, I don't know if I kind of really mentioned that. So this would be like the alert controller here. So I'm sure you've all seen something like this. So that's kind of what we're going to be making with those alert controllers here. All right, so let's go ahead, and I'm going to jump into the project here. Again, we're using a starter, so I'm just going to really quick, in maybe 5 minutes or less, go over what we have here, just so we can kind of get a broad overview. So if we look at the storyboard, it's already done for us, which is nice. The one thing with this that I'll mention that we haven't used before, this being the picker view, when you drag out a picker view, don't do this because it's going to break the project, but I'll just show you. It's just another item that we have in our object library, and we're able to choose, do we want to use a date picker, which again, it's kind of like got built in, it's got date and time sort of built in there. Or if you want to do something else like we will today, where you're going to just drag in a normal picker view, and then it has this just kind of as, I guess, placeholder default text. It doesn't actually show that, but it actually behaves somewhat similar to a table view, where we actually have to communicate to the picker view and say, hey, it's going to ask us like, hey, what information do you want me to show? And it ends up being actually a really similar implementation to what we've done with a table view. So I don't think it'll feel very different to you, I suppose. So it's somewhat more complex than a table view, but only if we've only used a table view with one section, which we have. So I'm going to go over to the countdown.swift. We'll look at the view controller because that's kind of, or we'll look at that last because that's ultimately where we'll kind of start the actual code today. This has a lot to it, and I want to talk about timers here. This countdown is essentially the object that's going to behind the scenes, not necessarily in a visual sense, it's going to be the thing that's keeping track of this kind of whole functionality here of like this timer counting down, whether the timer has started, if it's finished, if we reset, and we can kind of see that here with this countdown state. Right, enum to track the state of countdown. Ben's added some really great comments in here just to let us kind of know what everything's doing. So this countdown state is going to be, again, keeping track of, kind of where this countdown is at here. There's a lot here, and what I want to do is I'm going to pull over a playground and specifically just go over, I might just do it in the view controller. I want to just make a timer without all of this stuff around it, because I don't want you to feel like timers are complex and complicated because you're looking at this countdown, class itself, and you're like, whoa, there's, a lot that has to go into making a timer. It's actually really kind of simple when you kind of break it down. There's just kind of a lot of moving parts around it, but not necessarily directly tied to the timer in a sense. So we'll look at that in just a second. But really what we have here is a delegate, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm going to gloss over that. But then we have the duration and time remaining. And really what this is doing is we have this duration being set when we move this picker view here. So if I say I want it to be 2 minutes and 10 seconds, that's what the duration is going to be set to be. And then from there, what we're able to do is we're going to basically say, okay, I know how long this needs to run. So as I hit start here, and this is counting down, at any point in time, I need to know how much time is left. And that's where this time remaining comes from. So we've got the time remaining kind of coming from this time remaining computed property. And it's using this stop date here, which is coming from down here. This gets set a little bit below, and I'll kind of show you that in just a second here. But really, all it means is as soon as I hit start, have we actually talked about dates before? Do we just look at like date now? We looked at that one.
Yeah, just that one.
Okay, so that's really all you need to know. So it's just going to make a date from when you hit the start button, and then it's going to add on to that date the duration to get essentially when it should stop, right? So if it's 2 minutes and 10 minutes, 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the future, then that would be the stop date, and that time remaining is, like it says, it's derived from the number of seconds remaining when the countdown's active by saying, all right, let's take the stop date, which is sometime in the future, and figure out how much time is left, between now, whenever that is, like 53 seconds, and that stop date. All of this stuff here is, again, sort of a moving part around the timer to make it so that we can visually display how much time is left to the user, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the timer. So again, I'm not trying to scare you here. I just want you to kind of know more or less what we have kind of with this whole countdown object. And again, that state, this is just an instance of one of these enum cases here. So, depending on what's going on with the timer, the state is going to be something. So right now it's reset. When I hit start here, the state will be start. And then if I were to, actually run the timer out, the state would be finished. And that'll become useful in just a second here. So then we kind of have these three functions, which you could think about as programmatic or in code forms of doing something with the timer. So as an example, start is really just an encoded way of you hitting the start button. Reset is an encoded way of you hitting the reset button. And it turns out that cancel is just used both here and here to make sure that you don't accidentally like start more than one timer at the same time, because this app isn't set up for it. So it's really just like the code that you would put in the IB action without us having done the IB action yet. but this is going to be the thing that triggers everything. And I think, well, I want to come back to this part because I want to look at just a timer for us. And then we can come back to kind of what makes this unique here. And then this update timer here is really ultimately the thing that's going to give us the opportunity to visually display what's going on with our countdown object. So a timer, there is an actual data type called timer. This is all completely in code. Like there's no visual element to a timer object. It's just behind the scenes going to be counting down at every X amount of seconds or whatever, and you can have it repeat, but it's just, you know, running some code every X amount of seconds. So in order to visually show, you know, like the time actually going down, we need to have someone that can actually display that information, display the information. This is a countdown object. It's just a class countdown. It has no sort of, I guess, window into the views, right? That, like we talked about with MVC, this is almost like a model object, and it doesn't really have the ability to, you know, say, oh yeah, your countdown label needs to be X amount of seconds. So what we do is we have a delegate, and our view controller here is going to be the thing that's going to be updating the timer for us. So that's something that we'll be implementing in just a minute here. But ultimately what's happening is this update timer, like it says here, it's called each time the timer object fires. And when there's kind of some weird terminology that goes on with a timer here. But when a timer fires, that would be, it sort of has reached its, you know, interval. So if I say, I want a timer to go off every 5 seconds, at the end of those 5 seconds, the timer would fire. That's kind of the terminology there. It's a little weird. So if we kind of look at this, well, actually, let's talk about a timer first, and then we'll look at the one that's already implemented. So let's just all go to the countdown view controller.swift and completely ignore everything that's in here. I just want to talk about timers first of all, and then we can get into, you know, kind of how the one in the countdown.swift is working. So I'm going to pull up timer in the documentation here. And there's not a ton to this. It's just, it says it fires after a certain time interval has elapsed, sending a specified message to a target object. So I think this part is, excuse me, is the more confusing part. Sending a message to a target object. So what does a message mean, and, you know, what is a target object? This would make a lot more sense if we were learning Objective-C right now, because the terminology tends to kind of flow a little bit better with, you know, what you would call like calling a function in Objective-C. Ultimately, what happens is you kind of have a couple things. You've got this time interval, you have that sending a message, and then you've got a target. So the message would essentially be the function or the code that you want to call. And the target would be basically be, you know, who do you want to receive that message so they can call a function here. I know it's a little small for you probably, but if you look over here on kind of the top left, there's the section for creating a timer. And we've got like 8 options here. There are a lot of different ways that you can initially set up a timer. I'm going to show you the 1 or maybe 2 that are the most common, but more than anything, it's just, these are the ones that almost everyone will use. And if you want to use another one, you can, but you have to do a little bit more work. Or it just may be that we haven't quite learned everything you would need to in order to, I guess, get it set up. So, well, yeah, I want to talk about the timer tolerance in just a second here, but let's do this. I'm just going to say timer, or let's say let timer equal. I'm going to do capital T timer dot. Then I'm going to say scheduled timer. And we have a couple options here. So this scheduled timer with time interval is the one that I use 99% of the time. And I'll explain why. So we have 3 arguments here. I'm going to put these on new lines, but you don't have to. I'm just trying to make this easier for you to read. This time interval here is how long should the timer wait in order for it to actually run some code. So let's maybe say like 4 seconds. So have we talked about time intervals before? I feel like we have, but maybe that was just last cohort. No? Okay, let's talk about that real quick. Time intervals are what we actually call a type alias. Has anyone heard of the word type alias before? It exists in other languages, so if you're coming from another language, it might be familiar to you. No? Okay, that's totally cool. So what this is saying is a type alias is saying, hey, I'm going to kind of give a new name to some type that already exists. We can see that time interval right here, it says it equals double. What that's essentially saying is anytime I refer to something as a time interval, the underlying type should just be a double, a floating point number. The reason that they're doing this is well, there's a few ways that you could do this. You might see it a little bit in networking, but the reason here is we're adding a little bit of extra meaning. Like it says here, a time interval value is always specified in seconds. So here's the thing. You could use a double to represent any number, right? You could say, I want it to run for 10 seconds or 10 years or 10 days or 10 milliseconds. You don't really know though, and that's the thing with just a double. So what they've done is they've said, let's create this type alias that, functionally works the exact same as a double. However, just by giving it a different name, I'm able to know every time I see time interval, I mean specifically seconds. Does that kind of make sense?
Would it kind of be like if you made a struct time interval and then just let time equal double or time double?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's just so they don't have to do that. Like that would be completely valid, but then it's just like a ton of work, and you actually kind of run into a little bit of compatibility issues where then if you wanted to use a function that takes in a double, you couldn't pass in the whole object. You just have to pass in that number, and then it loses its meaning. So there's kind of like a lot of things that you would have to do in order to make it work, I guess, naturally. And so what they do is they say, treat this like a double everywhere. However, just call it a time interval. You're just giving it a new name. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
Could we also do this, like making custom type aliases?
Absolutely. Yep, it's as simple as writing this exact syntax here. So if you wanted to, you could just say like type alias, and you can actually see there's just a built-in kind of autocomplete for you. So you could say like years, right? You could say like years as a double as well. Different time, but since I've called it years, I know, oh, whenever I'm like, this is a double, so if I do like 1.0, what I mean really is, 1 year. And there's a little bit of extra kind of meaning attached to that, if that makes sense. Any questions on type aliases, Cody?
Can that type alias do sub 1 second representation? Like in networking, often you're working in milliseconds, nanoseconds. Can you do that with time interval?
Yes. Let me jump back to the documentation actually. Yeah, it yields sub millisecond precision. It's a double. It has as much precision as a double does, because it really just is a double. So you would, yeah, it's got precision. You wouldn't have to worry about that at all. Do we feel okay with the concept of time intervals? Any other questions about that, or type aliases in general? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm just gonna say, let's have this timer run after 5 seconds, run some code after that. Here's the cool part. We can decide, do we want this to just be a one-off? We just want it to wait 5 seconds and then we're done. And then it will never, call this whatever code we put in here again. Or do we want it to repeat? And so it's just on a constant 5-second loop, and every 5 seconds it does something. There's, times where you would want one over the other. It just kind of depends. Let's just say, just for fun, we'll have it repeat. So it'll run every 5 seconds. Now, this block here, this is, again, a closure, and I'm going to be a little hand-wavy here, and I'm going to kind of gloss over it a little bit. What we're going to do is make a function that we can just call right there. So let's just call this like, let me see.
Hand wavy.
All right, sounds good. Hand wavy. And the thing with this, and I know this probably isn't going to make sense, and you'll, in the next week of class that you have in 2 weeks, you'll be going over closures. So this hand waviness is going to be a lot, like you'll know how to fix this. But I need to make sure that my function has a timer object. Otherwise, it won't let me call this function right here. So I'm just going to say timer like that. You can call it whatever you want, but the type has to be a timer. And then let's just print, waving my hand, I guess. Doesn't really matter what we do in here. Once you do that, though, then I can say for this block, I'm going to put my hand wavy function right there. And it looks a little bit weird. The syntax is probably new. Just looking at what this looks like here, where we don't actually pass in any value for the argument, that's normal. It's just weird looking. You may be able to actually get away with just putting hand wavy like that, which I tend to do. It'll work the exact same. It just looks, I think, a little bit cleaner. But if that's confusing to you, you can just leave it like that, and that works the exact same. So you can take your pick on that. But just know when you see this, everything is working. You don't need to pass anything in right here for the timer. So let's run this here and see what we get. I'm going to wait 5 seconds here. And there we go. We see that we get this waving my hand. So if I wait a little more time, I get waving my hand again. So it's just on this 5-second loop of calling this function over and over again. In a nutshell, that's really all there is to setting up a timer. It's that simple. You say how often you want it to run, if you want it to repeat or not, and the code you want it to run. So before I kind of do a 1 to 3, let's talk about, well, okay, what if I don't want this to keep running, right? What if I'm, I've reached the end of my my time that I needed to wave my hand here. The hand waving is over. What we could do is we could say, well, this isn't really going to make any sense because it's not actually going to do anything, or it's not going to look like it's doing anything because I'm going to cancel the timer immediately. But if you wanted to stop the timer, so I'm just going to say sometime later, we could say timer.invalidate. So like it says here, it stops the timer from ever firing again and requests its removal from the run loop, which we haven't really talked about run loops. So I'm going to, again, kind of gloss over that. But in doing that, then the timer will stop. So I think the wording is a little bit weird on timers where we've got like this block and time interval and fire and invalidate. It seems a little bit weird, but once you get used to the syntax, it can be a little bit, it gets a little better. It's a little unique though. So if I were to run this now, it would look like nothing's happening because I'm, you know, making the timer, but then I'm just immediately invalidating it. So it'll never say that, you know, waving my hand. My hand is tired. That's good.
So is this how we set up for manually running the clock?
Yes, like to have it count down here.
Yeah, so like having the, I forgot my question now.
Here, let me jump back to this. Like having this count down.
So invalidating it here is a part of having, never mind.
You would only invalidate it when you want the timer to stop, right? Like this doesn't make any sense because I'm making it and immediately invalidating it or stopping it. But I'm just saying sometime later when you don't want it to keep repeating, then you just invalidate it. Okay, so let's take a look real quick and then I'll do a 1 to 3. If we jump back to the countdown.swift, and we're not gonna write any code, you can even just watch me here. Let's take a look at what we've got here. So in our start button, or our start method, which again is really just going to get called when we tap the start button, we see that we have a timer, .scheduled timer, just like we did, but the time interval is 0.03 seconds. And that's the really cool part about this is in order to get this behavior where, you know, it's counting down the milliseconds really quickly, all we're doing is we're having that loop be tighter. So instead of running every 5 seconds, we have it run every, you know, 300ths of a second. And that's completely fine, which is pretty cool. So you've got a lot of flexibility that comes from making these timers, and just changing that time interval can give you some really cool behavior. We just say we want it to repeat, and then the code to run is just update timer, which is that function down below that we'll look at in a second. So we see, like, if I reset my timer here and I hit reset, it's kind of a little bit, you need to follow here. Cancel timer is called, which then, like we see here, just invalidates the timer. So when I tap my reset button, it stops the timer. It's not trying to continually, you know, keep dropping this labels text down to, you know, X every 0.03 seconds. So yeah, Hunter, let's talk about that. That's a great thing to bring up. So if you are using this timer.scheduled timer method, this is called a convenience method. If you notice, this is actually a function that exists on the timer itself. It's not an instance method. However, if you did want to do, like you're saying, where you want to set up a timer that you don't want to use right away, you would just say, like, let later timer equal timer, and then you would just use one of these here. That gets into run loops, and it's, I think, a little bit more complicated than it's worth. And generally, you tend to just set up the timer as soon as you want it. There's not really much of a huge benefit to setting up the timer sometime kind of early and then calling it when you need it. I would just create it, you know, as soon as you need it, which is why I think the scheduled timer is nice, because it creates it, but it also just immediately starts it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that explains it.
Okay, perfect. Great question though. All right, let's do a quick poll here. I just want to see how we feel about setting up a timer. And again, it's like, could you do this code? I'm not necessarily looking for like, when should you use this? That's less of a concern for me, but just like, do you feel good conceptually with this? And do you think you could write out your own timer? So go ahead and give me a 1 to 3 in the Slido here. That would be much appreciated. And again, I'm more specifically just talking about like this stuff that, this stuff that we've done here. Well, I guess it's really more like this stuff. Okay, while we're waiting for everyone to vote on that, what questions or comments do you have about this?
Is there a way you can set how many times the timer runs and then it invalidates?
Sure.
In between creating it and invalidating it?
Yeah, what you could probably do is something you'd have to maybe just keep your own counter. So I would probably do something just like var times fired, is 0. And then this is a little more work. What I would do, you need a reference to this timer outside of this function so that your block function could run it. So this isn't actually going to compile, but what you would do is something like, you know, if times fired is less than, or, you know, is greater than 10, then timer dot invalidate, right? Something like that. Oh, actually you have the timer right there. Never mind. This actually would work. So then we could just say times fired plus equals 1 at the end of this. I'm gonna maybe drop this down to like 1 second here. So it'll wave the hand 10 times and then it should invalidate it after that. And there we go.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So you just have to kind of build that yourself. There's no, I guess, built-in support for it just saying, you know, run X amount of times. But what you have to do to make that work is not terribly hard. Okay, I think we feel okay with this. It looks like we have a few ones. So is there anything else I can go over, or is it just a matter of kind of using it a couple times? Okay, let's.
It looks like there's some questions in the Slido.
Yep, I just saw that. Thank you. I don't know if I understand hand waving. Maybe it's just the name. Yeah, that's probably. So maybe I'll call this like timer went off or something like that. What's happening here is timer went off. So all this function is, whether it's called hand waving or whatever, this is the code that we want to run every X amount of seconds with our timer here. So after 5 seconds, it will run the timer went off function. Or, you know, if it's not repeating, then you would just it would just run one time. It's just, again, that timer is just counting down, and when it gets down to 0, what do you want it to do? And that's what you would put in this block here. Yes, is the block just what you want to do after the timer completes? Yes, after those X amount of seconds have gone. And again, it would happen every time if you set it to repeat, but yes, that's exactly right.
Would you explain fire again?
Re-explain what?
Fire.
Fire, yes. So fire is the act of actually calling this function. So if I, for example, you would never really do this, but if I have, well, I'll leave it at 5 seconds, but I'm going to show you that if I just call fire like 5 times here, you'll notice that as soon as I run this function, or I run the app, it calls waving my hand 5 times. So the act of getting down to 0 from our 5 seconds is what's going to run our block function, and the act of running this block is called firing. So if you want to manually set off the timer, you call timer.fire, or behind the scenes when it gets to 0, it will fire and call your timer went off function. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so in the manual instance, like pressing start, would that be firing the timer?
In a sense, more than anything, it would be, if we look at this, it's just starting the timer. And since this is running every, 3/100ths of a second, it will just wait that, 3/100ths of a second to then fire. But yes, if we really wanted to, we could definitely just say timer.fire to immediately have it start, and that would work. Do we need the invalidate to get it to stop? Is that only if you made it repeat? Yes, so that's a great question. So if we only had it, or if we didn't have it repeat, then it would run once and it would just invalidate itself. You can actually see here, it will say that. Well, let me go into the documentation so I can make it a little larger. Timer. If true for the repeats, the timer will repeatedly reschedule itself until invalidated, which we've looked at. And then if false, the timer will be invalidated after it fires. So it will automatically invalidate itself if we just set it to false for the repeat. Can you not use a block? Yeah, I guess you could, but the whole point of the whole point of a timer is to have it do something. So if you didn't do anything in the block, it would just be like you're kind of running something in the background without necessarily doing anything for it. If that makes sense. If anyone has a follow-up to that, feel free to ask. I guess I'm not quite sure why you would want to do that.
Well, if your timer's in a program that's not necessarily, well, even this program, you're using, you're mapping the timer to the clock display. Wouldn't you want to do that without running any print statement in the background that the user isn't seeing and just using up CPU cycles for ostensibly no reason? Well,
yeah, the code that we're going to run in order to update the views is going to be like in this function.
Oh, okay.
So yes, you're totally right though. I'm going to come back to that. That'll kind of be a good segue here, and then we'll take a break. So would you write a line of code saying if foo equals 1 minute, timer invalidate? Sure. Yeah, I mean, if it's gone on for 1 minute, if you're keeping track of how long it's been running, if you want it to stop after a minute, then invalidate it. Yeah, that would work. What's the difference between fire and the start function? Fire is you calling whatever your block is immediately. Whereas, well, I guess with the start function, we look at that, all that's doing is exactly what we're doing in the view to load, which is just starting that timer immediately. And then it will start firing itself in the background. So real quick before we take a break here, I know we've gone over 40 minutes, but I'm just gonna kind of try to keep us all together and then we'll move on. Going back to our start function, this is essentially, like this code right here is doing exactly what we were just doing, in our view controller, where we just set up a timer here. Now the code that we run when we do that is gonna call the update timer function, which is at the bottom here. So Cody, this is going back to your question. Yes, you're right. Using the timer to just print something is not very useful. So instead what we're going to do is we have a little logic here to say, let's see if our current time is less than or equal to the stop date, meaning, like it says here, the timer's still active. We're still counting down. We haven't quite got to the whoops, let me run this. We haven't quite got down to 0 yet, so we know we need to keep running. Then it's going to tell the delegate, which will be our view controller, hey, can you go update the label so that it actually shows how much time is left? Or once it gets down to 0, then it's going to say, oh, sweet, we're done. Let's cancel the timer and invalidate it. We'll set stop date to nil and kind of do a little bit of cleanup here. But then we also say, hey, view controller, the countdown finished, and that's when you would see the alert controller appear here. So it's just a matter of communicating between our timer object and letting the view controller know sort of what's going on with it. So again, we see that timers themselves are not complex. It's a matter of one line of code here and writing some function. But they can be very powerful to the point where now we can have this great communication between saying every 0.03 seconds, I need to update this label's text. And that's actually what we're doing. As I hit the start button here, I'm literally setting this label's text every 0.03 seconds. And that's fine. It's not like an issue as far as resources go, but it's not like there's some magic function to just have it count down. We're just manually setting the text over and over and over again using this countdown did update method that we'll look at in a second. So again, there's a lot going on here. I want you to not feel scared of timers because ultimately they are very simple in and of themselves. And then, what you do with them can be very powerful though. So, all right, let's take a break. We'll come back and we will kind of dive into alert controllers, and then we'll get into kind of writing the rest of this code with the pickers and everything. So see you guys in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. Did anyone have any questions come up during the break that they wanted to ask? No? Okay. All right, so let's take out this kind of timer that we were just playing with. I'm just gonna clear out this code here from the view to load. And we'll also delete that timer when off function as well. So we're just kind of putting it back to the way that it was. So let's talk about alert controllers now. These are called UI alert controllers.
What did you just delete?
Oh, just what we had here. So the timer went off and the timer code that we put in the view to load, and that's all. So let's talk about alert controllers here. In a nutshell, they really only have, I guess, 4 parts, really, kind of 3, but mostly 4. So all it says is it's an object that displays an alert message to the user. So let's kind of take a look at this and we can break down each of these things. So when you create an alert controller, there's only one initializer, so we really only have one choice here, which is fine. And if we look at this here, maybe pull it right here. We have a title that we need to give it. We have a message that we need to give it, and then this preferred style here. So title would be this slightly bolder text right here. The message would be this smaller text, and then the preferred style here, I'll show you what that is. So we have 2 styles. We have alert, which is the one that we see here, where it's just that kind of thing that pops up in the middle of the screen. And in order to dismiss it, you have to, hit a button, right? That's the only way to kind of get out of it. The other way of showing an alert is, let me go into my solution code and just swap this out. If I can find it, there we go. The other one is called an action sheet. And it's just a different way to visually present the same information. So it's a matter of, this preferred style is an enum. So it's literally a matter of you saying .alert for the preferred style or .action sheet. So that's all you have to do, but you get something that looks quite a bit different, where now it's down here. And I'm sure you've seen probably both of these. So both alert controllers, they both work the same way. It's just a matter of you deciding what kind of style you want it to look like, which I think most people tend to use the alert, but in some cases having it down here can be kind of cool as well. So then that would be 3 of these parts, the title, message, and preferred style, but also we have these buttons here. And these are what are called alert actions. So each of these buttons is just an action that you basically say, what do you want the action to look like the text and everything that you want it to have, and also what do you want it to do when you tap the OK button, or when you actually tap that action. The actions will always dismiss the alert controller. But if you want to do anything extra on top of that, you can. So it's up to you. We're not going to do that today, but I'll kind of show you what I mean by this. And that is just a UI alert action. So we'll just look at that one in code here. So let's actually just, we already have a function called show alert that we're going to use as, we can just write this code here as both an example, but we can also just keep it here for when the app is completely working. So let's just initialize a new UI alert controller here. So I'm just going to say let alert equal UI alert controller, and then open up my parenthesis here. And then we're going to use that one that we saw in the documentation, the title, the message, and the preferred style. So for this, you can say whatever you want. It's just, you know, a string. And we actually see something interesting, which is both the title and the message are optional. So if you wanted to, you could do one or the other, or in theory, you could do neither, although I don't necessarily think that makes a ton of sense. But if you only want a title and no message, just put the title here, put the message to be nil, or vice versa, and that's completely fine. We'll just do both just so you can see kind of the visual difference between the two, but you don't need to do it always, which I think is kind of nice. So I'll just say timer finished, or well, let's maybe call this countdown finished. You don't have to do it exactly like I am, but, and then we'll just say your countdown is over. And then for the preferred style, let's just do dot, and then we get that alert or action sheet. So again, alert is the one that shows up right in the middle of the screen. The action sheet is the one that shows up down here, kind of at the bottom. I'm going to choose alert here, but you can choose action sheet if you want. Functionally, there's not really much of a difference. So here's a problem though. If I just want to present the alert as I have it now, this is what would happen. It would put the, well, let me actually do it the way that we have it with the alert style. It would look like this with no way of getting out of the alert. The only time that I ever see this, and you may have seen this if you updated your phones yesterday to the newest version of iOS, is it'll say like verifying update. There's a little indicator here, like a spinning wheel, but you can't get out of it. There's no way for me to even go back to the home. Oh yeah, I can go back home, but I can't use the app. It's essentially frozen, for lack of a better term. So I have no way to dismiss this, which means I can't really use the app. So when you're making an alert controller, we always need a action in order to, at the very least, dismiss it, if not also, you know, do some extra work. So I'm just going to say like let OK action equal a UI alert action. And we'll open up the initializer for this one. And this is fairly similar as well. This also has a title, which would be the, let me pull this back up to it actually being working. Just what text do we want to show when the action is shown? So the action being this thing right here. I'll show the style in just a second. And then the handler is any extra code that you want to run. Again, and I wave my hands a little bit here. We're not going to worry about this right now for the handler. So for the title, let's just say like okay, or dismiss, or cancel, whatever you want. So for the style, this is an enum as well. And we have three choices. We have cancel, default, and destructive. All this does, let me actually just copy this action so I can get 3 examples here. So the styles, this is the exact same action. However, the style is the only thing that's different. So default is this one, where it's just blue text by default, although you can change that, the tint. And it's just like a normal kind of level of boldness, like it's not bolded. Destructive, it turns the text red and it just indicates, hey, you know, this could potentially, you know, do something destructive, like deleting something or removing something. It's just a visual element. That's all it is. It doesn't actually necessarily do anything bad or, you know, destructive, but that's what you should use it for, is when you have something that could potentially, I guess, you know, modify their data in a way that is unrecoverable. And then cancel is, it's still blue, although the text is a little bit more bolded, and it will put the text at the bottom. It will always, this is actually the second action that I added, but it's actually the third thing that gets put here because the cancel always goes at the bottom. Not that you really need to remember that too much. Generally, I'm using alert controllers for like 1 or maybe 2 actions, but you know, that's what these styles would do. So for us, let's just put default or cancel. It doesn't really matter. Either one is great. Again, it's just a visual change. That's really all the change will do. And then for the handler, we see that it's actually optional. It's got a question mark at the end. So I'm just going to put nil here and say, I don't want to do anything extra. This will dismiss the alert controller, but not do anything else. No handler. So you'll, again, learn about closures the next sprint that you have, and you know, adding one in would not be hard at all at that point. So one thing I do want to go back to the documentation for, though, is if we look back at Alert Controller, we actually see that it inherits from UIPickerView, which I think is really kind of interesting. So this itself, just this little box here, is actually its own view controller. Little interesting. What that means, though, is we can present it just like we would any other view controller. And I'm not quite sure if we've ever, have we ever called the present method before? I don't believe we have. No? Okay. So we'll talk about that here. Any view controller, like, for example, our countdown view controller, has a method called present. Like it says here, presents a view controller modally. This would be like almost as, well, visually, it looks the same as if you were to make a modal segue from the storyboard to, you know, a different view controller. It's just that you don't actually have to create the segue yourself. So it's just an encode of an encode way of presenting, you know, another view controller. And since the alert itself is a view controller, we're able to do that. So, well, we need to add one line before this, but let's fill this out here. So all we need to do is put present alert and then decide, do we want it to animate? And I'm going to say true. Generally, for the animated, I put true because I like the, you know, I don't like things to just kind of snap in, but I like it to have, you know, kind of that fade in effect and everything. So I put true. Completion, again, this is optional. I'm going to put nil here. But what that does is it lets you actually present and almost like performing a segue completely in code to another view controller. It just happens that our view controller is, that alert controller, so it has a little bit of special behavior. But in theory, you could do this with any view controller you want. Yes, exactly. So the question is, would the handler be where you write the code to, for example, delete the image or something? Yes, that's exactly right. Or, call the function that deletes the image or something like that. Yeah, that's exactly what you would do.
So could you potentially use a system of UI alerts as your navigation menu system? You
Sure.
could sort of present the segues as the actions.
Yeah, in theory, yeah, you could do that. Just there's a way of programmatically performing a segue. Even if you've made the segue in the storyboard, you can sort of trigger it in code. So yeah, you could in theory do that if you wanted to. That would definitely work. We see though that this action is not being used. It's saying you made it, but it was never used. So if we present this now, we're not calling this anywhere. But if we were to present that now, it would be like when there was no way of dismissing it. So we need to actually use the action. And the way that we do that is we attach the action to the alert. So I'm going to say alert dot add action. I'm going to put my OK action there. We're going to do that before we present the alert. Otherwise, it's not actually going to show up once it's presented. As a small aside, if you really wanted to, you don't do this, but if you really wanted to, you could like do that. So you don't even have to make the constant for the action. You can just kind of inline write the action there yourself. Either way works great. I'm trying to keep things simple and kind of easy to follow here, but if you wanted to, you could just write it inline and that would work the same. And that's all there is to alert controllers in a nutshell. There is a little bit more customization that you can do. Something really nice that comes basically for free is you've probably seen where one shows up and it's got like a text field in there for you to enter in a username or password or something like that. Not that we're going to do it here. I'm going to remove this in just a second, but there's this really easy add text field method to just get a text field in there for free. So that can be nice as a kind of a cool tool to, get the text field in there. You don't have to constrain it or anything. It's just kind of places it right exactly where it should be, which is pretty cool. So we're going to set, oh, go for it. Sorry.
Do you need to set an outlet to the view controller for that text field? The one presented in the UI action? No? Okay.
No, what you would end up doing is probably like in this OK action, you would grab that text field and then, pull the text out of it and use it that way. If you want, like maybe like in Friday's Q&A or something, we could talk about it. I could show you an example, but it's not going to be anything you'll need for now ever. So we're going to leave this here. Just to test this, let's just really quickly put this in the start button tap. So we'll just call show alert here. We're going to obviously remove this in just a second, but just so that we can test our app out and test the alert, hit start, and we should get this to appear. Oh, I might have the outlets or the actions broken. Yep, they're broken. My bad. Okay, so if you will open up the assistant editor so you have the storyboard and your countdown view controller file, then we can, are my outlets broken? Oh, weird. Sorry about that. So you can actually just go from this little circle here and drag over to the start button. And then I'll do the same thing for the reset button. And those should get filled in. And if you hover over these circles, it should show you and kind of highlight the element that it's attached to over on the storyboard side. And then it looks like if we scroll up as well, the countdown picker is not working either. So I'm gonna just make a connection or reconnect that by dragging the circle back over to my picker view as well. Sorry about that. I'll fix that for the next cohort. But now if you hit the start button, it should present our alert controller here.
What was that third outlet? I didn't catch that one. The last one you just did.
Yeah, it was the countdown picker. Just drag that right over. What is the present? Yeah, let me talk about that. So the present is the thing that is making it actually show up on the screen. It's saying, take this alert that I just made and literally present it to the user. And you're able to call present on any view controller that you want, including an alert controller, which is a subclass of UI view controller. So that's the thing that when I hit this point, it is actually showing that to the user. Okay, how are we feeling so far? Questions on alerts?
Can you scroll back up to what you added to the button, please?
Yes, just the show alert method right here.
Oh, okay. I don't have the brackets. Did you add all those?
Scroll down a little bit. So we've got the outlet up here, but then if you scroll down, it's in the action a little bit below that.
Okay. Looks like I have to set those up too.
These should already be there.
My buttons weren't hooked up to anything, so.
Oh yeah, you'll have to reconnect those as well.
The countdown picker is not showing up for me.
Yeah, does it look like that for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. We haven't got to that part yet.
Okay.
No worries on that part.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna throw up another poll here. If you can just give me a 1 to 3 on alert controllers, that would be fantastic. There we go. It is up. And again, if you guys want, we can definitely talk about adding text fields to the alert controller, you know, on Friday's Q&A or something. Real quick, as an aside, you can add basically as many actions as you want. I've only really seen this in one app, but in theory, if you were to add 20 actions here and it was literally more actions than could fit on the screen, it would automatically let you scroll through them. It would kind of add this scrolling functionality for free. So in theory, there's kind of no limit to the amount of actions you can have. Again, I've really only seen it in like one app, but you can do it in theory.
So is that like with adding the actions, is that we can put like a function in the handler and like have a button to call something else?
Exactly. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. So you could have it delete something. You could, you could make another action that's like restart timer and have it immediately start a new timer without you even having to hit start again, right? Sky's the limit as far as what you do with those actions, which is kind of the cool part. All right, do you guys mind if we take our break 5 minutes early? This is just a nice kind of cutting off point. Okay, let's do that. Come back and we'll talk about our picker view. Okay, welcome back. All right. Does anyone have any questions while we're waiting for everyone to hop back in? Okay, all right, sounds good. So let's go ahead and talk about our kind of third topic here, which is these UI picker views. So before we do that, let's just real quick take out the show alert function from the start button tap. So it's not actually, that's not where we should actually have it. We're just using that to test. So let's remove that. So a couple things that we need to do here as far as setting up our picker view goes. First of all, let's take a look at a picker view itself. So UI picker view. So we've seen sort of the way that it looks, but like it says here in our discussion, it displays one or more wheels that lets the user manipulate items or select items that way. In the second part here is where I kind of want to talk about, which is you provide the data to be displayed in your picker view using a picker data source, an object that adopts the UIPickerView data source protocol. And then there's also the PickerView delegate to provide the views for displaying the data. So this is very similar to setting up a table view, and it's essentially, for all intents and purposes, it's the same process. We need to say, how many things we want in our picker view, how many rows we want in the picker view, and so on, and what needs to be displayed, just like we would with a table view, saying how many sections we want, how many rows we want in each section, and what each row or cell should display. So if we look at the bottom of our file here, we've got two extensions here for the UIPickerView data source, and one for the PickerView data source and one for the UIPickerView delegate. So let's go ahead and set this up. And this way is the way that, and we can kind of even see here in the simulator, right now there's nothing there. It just is, blank, which isn't necessarily super useful for us right now. So what we have is, and you can just watch me here, I'm gonna jump back down to that code in just a second. We've got this countdown picker data array here. Ignore the lazy for now. I'll talk about that in a minute here. It's not anything that you need to worry about right now, though. It won't affect anything we're doing for now. What type is this? I don't know if we've ever seen this before.
Is that an array of strings?
Yeah, it's an array of arrays of strings. So think about it like if we think about a string as a can of food, a single can of food. We could think of an array of strings as a box of multiple cans of food. Then if we go out, it's like we've got one bigger box that holds multiple small boxes of food. So we've just got one big container that holds smaller containers of food. So the thing with this is maybe one container, one of the smaller containers has 5 cans of food, and another one has 20, and another one has 1. All of these individual smaller arrays can have as many cans of food as they want. But then we just have one kind of big box to carry them all at once. That's kind of what we've got going on here. So let me pull up the solution code and I'll kind of show you what we're doing. So we ultimately have this, I'm going to gloss over this for just 2 seconds here. I'll come back to it, I promise. But ultimately, the thing that we're returning is this data constant here, which is an array of 4 individual arrays. And we see here that, let me see if I can do this. What happens is this minutes is an array of numbers from 0 to 60. And so minutes here becomes this first, what we would call column, or I actually believe it's called component. Then we've got min, which is this one, seconds, which is this third part of our picker, and then sec, which is this 4th thing. So really what we're doing is we're using this array of arrays to hold all of the data for each of these individual components of our picker view. So it's like, you can almost think of this thing right here, like these numbers right here, as one mini table view, or I guess it would be more like one section in a table view, where we've only done one section before, so that's kind of all we're used to at this point. Then we've got another section here, another section here, and then another section here. So it's more like we're now going out of just the single section table view and we're expanding it out to a multi-section table view. And it behaves essentially the same way. So this array of arrays here is just an easy way to contain all of the information for all 4 of these sections in our picker view. Don't worry too much about like map. We haven't talked about these higher order functions. I have a great article that I will send you on higher order functions if you're curious, but it's not anything that you need to know right now. We'll definitely get to them though. But essentially what it's doing is it's taking an array of numbers from 0 to 60 and turning them into an array of strings so that they can actually be displayed on these cells. They have to be in a string format. And same with the seconds as well. That's really all that's happening there. It's very similar to kind of like a quick and easy, more, I guess, concise for loop in a sense, sort of. So if we use this countdown picker data as sort of the data source for our picker view here, we can go back down and take out these warnings. I think these are so cool. These are relatively new, where you do like pound warning and it will actually create a warning for you. I think that's awesome. So it says change this to return the number of components for the picker view. So these components would be each of these things. So how many components do we have in our picker view, or do we want? 4. Yeah, how do you know that? I mean, that's kind of a weird question, but.
Because there's the number, there's the int wheels, there's 2 of those, and there's 2 string wheels.
Yeah, and where do you get that information from? You're exactly right.
Well, I'm not sure in code, but like you would think about a timer as having minutes and seconds, and you would want to label them as minutes and seconds. So
yeah, for sure. Can anyone help Violet out as far as where specifically in code you get that information from?
From the countdown picker date.
Yeah, from the countdown picker data up here. Perfect. So, and again, we're trying to, just like with table views, I'm trying to steer you away from using return 4 here, but instead if we do countdown picker data dot count, that's still 4. But if I wanted to, for example, add maybe hours to my picker, I would just have to add, those 2 new arrays to my countdown picker data, and the picker view itself would just, add those 2 new components, no problem, and I wouldn't have to do any extra work. So we're going to say we need 4 components here. So then we need to know, okay, here's where things get a little bit different because we're now dealing with multiple components. If this was the number of rows in section from our table view, what would we return here? if we were just thinking about this like a table view from what we've done so far.
A cell?
Not quite. So this would be like that very first function that we do. This, I guess the parallel to this would be the number of sections in the table view. So this is usually the one that we delete in a sense. Sorry, did someone say something?
That's what I was going to say. That's the one that is usually set to default as 1, and then or you delete it.
Right. So what about this one to say how many cells we want, or in other words, well, that's really small. How many cells we want in sort of this vertical sense?
You'd want a cell for each array in your hours array or minutes array, I guess.
Yeah.
For each element in your array.
Right. So now we have to think about, we've got this big box of food that holds these smaller boxes. Well, each box, like I said, could have a different amount of food items. So I don't want to return, like straight 60, because in this case, 60 is great for, my first one when I have 60 rows that I need. But then what about for min? I only have 1 right here. I don't have, 60 min labels right here. So we have to kind of go through individually and say, well, for this column or this component, I need 60. For this one, I need 1. For this one, I need 59 or whatever it is, and then 1 again. So the way that we're going to do this is we're just going to access each element with its component here. So I'll kind of show what I mean here. Let's write this out and then I'll show it. So instead of doing countdownpickerdata.count, because that's just going to return 4, that's not what we want. We need to look inside of each array inside of this kind of bigger array here. So we're going to use this component here, and we can say, well, we need to know which component it's trying to set up, right? Is it currently trying to set up component 0? Is it trying to set up component 2? Which one is it? And then we can say that component's count. Excuse me. So I'm going to put, this is like looking inside one of the smaller containers, arrays, in the large array of arrays. Does that kind of make sense? Do we feel okay with that? Can I explain that again?
So just to kind of clarify, when you say countdown picker component, so then like we're narrowing it down to one of the arrays in our array of arrays, and we want the count of that array.
Exactly. So it would be like we're accessing one of these smaller arrays, right? Where it's like, if it's minutes, then we know that there's going to be 61 things in this array. If the component is component 1, it would be, because it's using indexes, it would grab this array, and then we could say .count of this array, and it would be just, there's one thing in that array. Or seconds, there would be 60. Or in sec, it would be 1.
And component is just a predefined term.
Yes, so that's a great question. I always wondered about things like that. Where is this coming from? If you're not sure where something's coming from, always look at the arguments to the function. That's generally where things come from, like index path and all of that. They're always going to be, almost always going to be coming from somewhere in there. So it's just the picker view is telling us, hey, I'm trying to set up this specific component. Maybe it's component 2 or component 0. Can you tell me, what I need? And so we just say, oh yeah, well, what you need for component 0 is this. Or when it calls this for component 1, it'll be something different. Do we feel okay with that? So now we would have, we've told the picker view we need 4 sections here, and we need X amount of rows in each component here, or in each section. We haven't told it quite what it needs to look like though. This is where the picker view differs a little bit from the table view, where, you know, in a table view, you'd have like the cell for row at, and it's a part of the data source protocol. In the picker view delegate, it's actually, or sorry, for a picker view, kind of that parallel to a table view is actually part of the picker view delegate. And it is the title for row, and then it's for component. It should just be this one. And again, you should just be able to have that autocomplete if you're inside of this picker view delegate extension, because it knows you've adopted this protocol. So we get now kind of both pieces of information that we've kind of set up here, which is what component are we trying to set up, but also specifically what row is it trying to set up. So now it's going to go through and probably start at the top here. So at the 0th, on the 0th row, or sorry, at the 0th component, this one, at the 0th row right here, what should the title be, right? And it's going to go through and say, all right, we've got that one, let's go to the next one, what should it be, and so on. And it just kind of loops through until you feed it all of that information. So can anyone help me out here if I wanted to kind of follow along with this pattern of using the countdown picker data to get that information? If I said, like, let title equal countdown picker data something, how could I pull out one individual item from one of the smaller arrays in my countdown picker data?
For a loop?
Okay, good guess. We just need to do it once, and then this actually will kind of behind the scenes loop and get called multiple times. So we just have to worry about doing it once.
I'm sorry, this is going to sound dumb, but can you, what are we trying to do with this function again?
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I didn't really explain that very well. That's my fault. So it wants us to return a string here. So really what that ends up being is the string that gets put like right here, for example, like on min or whatever. So we have to return it some string that it will then actually put on the picker for the user to see. So how can we go through and give it, you know, the piece of information that it's looking for a specific row at a specific component?
An array?
Okay.
Would you say like countdown picker data brackets component row, and then brackets after that for a component? So
yes, you're right. Although component would go first.
Okay, I wasn't certain which one would go first.
Yeah. So we're gonna access which component first. So that would be like the smaller array, and then which thing inside of that component second. So what would we do after this?
It would be more brackets and then the row.
Yeah. Perfect. That looks probably really weird. We could, if you want, I can write it like this. So I can say like, let component equal our countdown picker data at component. And then we could say like, let row equal our component, or let's not call that component. Let's say, sorry, it's conflicting with this name. That's why. Let's call this, I'll just call it like comp. And then we could say component, or sorry, row. There we go. And then that would give me the string. So we're drilling down from this large array of arrays to maybe like this minutes array. And then within that minutes array, we need to say, well, I want the 42nd thing in that array, right? And then you would do like that. That's kind of what's happening there. We just drill down multiple levels since we have an array of arrays. And that would give us a string. And then we could just return that. Do you feel okay with that? Is that weird? Can I explain anything again?
Sorry. So just to clarify again, with this function, it's pretty much just wants this. Well, it's asking like, how do I display? You want to display each row in each column as a string?
Yeah, exactly. So it's literally going to loop through for as many components as we have. It's going to say, how many components do you want? We're going to say 4. So then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to run this function 4 times then and say, for each component, how many rows do you want in that? And then, each one has its own number of components. Then it says, okay, let's go through here and one by one have you tell me what each row here should be. So we say, I'm assuming the first time this runs, the row is going to be 0 and the component is going to be 0, meaning this, this one right here. And we say, oh, I want it to be 0, and then 1, then 2, then 3, and so on until it's gone through each component, each vertical sort of column here, and gone through and have you give it all of the information it needs for every single one of these little rows here. Do we feel okay with that? Are we all lost?
How are we turning the values from the picker view back into ints for the timer?
That's a great question. We haven't quite got there.
Okay.
So hold that thought, and then we'll get to that part. Okay, so let's actually do that right now. Well, actually, we need to do one thing, and then we can run it to see if we've got this all working. So the one thing we haven't done is we haven't set ourselves as the delegate and data source for our picker view. So none of these functions would get called. Let's jump up to the view did load and just say, we have our countdown picker outlet right here. So I'm going to say countdown picker dot delegate equals self and countdown picker dot data source, equals self as well. So that's actually going to call those functions, and then the picker view can ask our view controller here what it should display. If we run that, we should get it working. It looks a little different, and we can talk about why, but it should be working at the least. It's not going to update this label or anything. We haven't quite got to that, but at the, functionally, you should be able to see these things on the picker itself. Is everyone's working? So we're, as far as sort of MVC goes here, we've got a lot of the views done. We have the model, which in this case is really kind of our countdown, but there hasn't been much of a, I guess, connection between really using the model, that countdown, in our view controller. We don't even have one in here yet. So now, as far as this goes, it's just a matter of kind of hooking up the relationship between our countdown object, which is, again, that timer that's kind of going to be working behind the scenes and running, a little bit of code every 0.03 seconds. And then we just need to make it so that these all kind of visually hook up to it. So I can hit the start button and call that start button or that start function from my countdown here. So that'll be our next part. So I'm just going to go up to maybe put this above my countdown picker data. It doesn't necessarily matter where I put it. We just say like let countdown equal countdown. Excuse me. And what we basically need to do is exactly what Cody was saying, which is we need to now convert our seconds, which in this case, or sorry, our seconds and minutes, which in this case right now are strings, and turn them into actual numbers so we can figure out how much time this needs to run for. So let's make a, oh, I need to call this count down. That would be good. There we go. Let's make a variable called duration. And I'm going to make this a time interval. Again, really, this is a double, but we know it means an amount of seconds. So again, it's just a little bit of extra meaning attached to our time interval here, or attached to the type. So for this, what we need to do is grab the rows from the picker and convert from minutes and seconds to a total number of seconds, right? So we need to actually say, like, if I'm on 5 minutes and 8 seconds, I need to pull out the number 5 and the number 8. But then 5 represents, 5 minutes. So we need to do like 5 times 60 and then add 8 onto that. And then we'll get that full duration that we want the countdown to run for. So grabbing the rows is actually really easy. Let me maybe have this over here. Okay. So which rows do we care about? We have 5 different columns. Which columns are the ones that we actually need the rows from?
The 2 with the digits, with the ints.
Yeah, exactly. So we would need the 0th and the 2nd. So I'm going to say, like, let's maybe call this like minute string equal, and then we're going to tell our picker, countdown picker, dot, can you give me the selected row in a given component? And so we'll say, I need the row at component 0, which is this one. And then we also need the selected row at component 3 here, which is 8 in this case. So I'll just say let second string and do basically the same thing, countdown picker, selected row in component 2, just like arrays, these start at 0, so 0, 1, 2. So then, in order to turn these into minutes, we'll just, again, we can't use that type coercion that we talked about in unit 1, or sorry, in sprint 1. But what we can do is we can just say, like, let minutes equal, and then we'll just initialize a new integer with the minute string, and it will convert that for us. And we'll do the same thing for seconds, equals int second string. And so from here, it's just a matter of, we need to kind of total up these seconds. So I'll maybe say, like, let total seconds equal, and then we just need to kind of turn the minutes into an X amount of time. And then also it's expecting a time interval where I just turn these into integers here. So let's say we'll do minute string times 60 plus our seconds.
You want to use minutes, not minute string.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm surprised that even let me. And because of order of operations, we're good here. We don't need to, like, put these in parentheses or anything. That'll work just fine. Oh, sorry, I need to maybe do it like that, put that comment there. And then finally, I'm just going to return a time interval with that total seconds here. So total seconds being an integer isn't quite the type that my duration's looking for. So I'm just going to turn it into a time interval, just a different kind of number here for me.
We can't see. There's something popped up.
Something popped up?
Popped up over your. Oh, maybe that's my screen. Yeah, sorry, that was my screen.
Oh, here.
Hey, it says for me, it says minute string is already an int. Is that incorrect? I mean, it's nothing's popped up. But just if I inspect it, it says it's already an int.
You are right. You're right. I'm not sure why I thought it was a string. I forget that this actually just gives you the index of that selected row instead of the actual title there. And it just turns out because these are numbers, it actually ends up working out great. So yeah, I apologize. You're totally right. Let's get rid of this let minutes and seconds here. And we can actually just call these, instead of minute string and second string, let's just call these minutes and seconds. That's why it wasn't yelling at me earlier when I was trying to put those two together when Cody told me. That makes more sense now. Thanks for the catch, that's great. So if we look at this again, it's just going to tell me the index of this item. So for example, maybe make a little bit more sense for min. If I did selected row in component 1, which is min right here, it would be giving me back a 0 as the index instead of the text min here. That's kind of what's happening.
So for future reference, how would we get that text? Would we then have to take that selected row index and then access the array that it's coming from?
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly what you would do. So we could say, if, for example, you wanted, I don't know, we'll do like this one here. I'm just going to say, don't write this. This is just an example. But if we wanted like let, min index, we could say countdown picker selected row in component 1 right here. So that would give us 0. And then we could say, all right, then let's go to our countdown picker data at section, or at the first, second index. And then we could say at min index, and then that would give us the text min, right? Yeah, we get that string. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now that we have this is where we can now start to kind of connect the countdown with that, the actual picker view and our start button and everything. So let's go down back now that as we're still kind of talking about the picker view. Let's scroll all the way down to the end of our file here, and we're going to add one more PickerView delegate function, which is this did select row in component. So going back to the delegate pattern, we have kind of two main forms of communication where the delegator is requesting some information. So for example, the title for row is one of those where it's saying, hey, what should the title for this row be? I don't actually know, so can you tell me what it is? However, there's also the other way when we say, hey, the PickerView is just sort of telling us, hey, a row was selected. If you want to do something, go for it. So that would be, this function would get called like when I move this and let go. It would say, oh, they just selected a new row. So if you want to do something, go for it. And for us, we should say, we probably want to tell the countdown that its new duration should be 6 seconds, or now 2 minutes and 6 seconds. So every time we change this, we'll make sure that our model, our countdown object sort of is in line with that. So they're always matching the same amount of time that they should run for. So we can just say countdown dot duration equals the duration that we just got. So this duration is coming from our countdown object in the other file, And this blue duration here is coming from that computed property that we just made. That's just pulling out whatever we have selected in our picker view and turning it into an amount of seconds. And we're just going to give that over to the countdown. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
Where did you say the second duration came from?
Yeah, so this one on the right here is coming from right here, just this computed property that we just made. So we're really just passing that over, that information that we just kind of figured out, back over to the countdown. So let's maybe wire up our buttons now so that they can actually do something. That would kind of be a helpful thing to do. So let's call a countdown.start. And then for the reset button tapped, we'll just call countdown.reset. Those functions are just, again, starting the timer, just creating that scheduled timer. And then the reset is just going to invalidate it and kind of set everything back to its initial state.
Can you scroll back down, please? I
Yes.
didn't finish typing out that function.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, crap.
You good?
Yeah, my hot corners are a bit touchy.
Oh. So then we kind of have really most everything working as far as the communication going to the countdown. So as an example, if I were to run this now, it's not going to really look like much is happening. But I can assure you that the countdown in theory would be working. Like it would actually start counting down. It's just that we don't really see anything happening here. And that's because we're not actually having the countdown come back to us and tell it that anything is happening. So,
sorry.
yeah.
Was I not supposed to put the show alert under the start button tapped?
We got rid of it. That was just a place for us to test it out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can delete that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we've got this update views function here. And this is, again, we've used update views a fair amount. It's just updating the visual elements of our view controller, whatever they may be. We need to fill this out, and then we can have the countdown tell us when to update the views, for example, to show a different duration as it's counting down. In order to do that, though, we need to then actually fill out this strength from duration function, because we're going to have to call that in our update views. So let's talk about this one. This is really cool, and it's going to use something called a date formatter. So like the warning says, we need to return a string value that's derived from the time interval that's passed into this function here, this duration. So this would be like the time remaining, essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little code snippet here, and we'll talk about it, but I don't want to take the time to write it out. So go ahead and grab that in the iOS 16 channel, and then let's put it somewhere like around these properties. It doesn't really matter. Maybe we'll
It's 11 o'clock.
Can I see the syntax again for the buttons?
It's 11 o'clock.
Please.
Yeah. So just go ahead and throw that code snippet, above where you have the other constants and variables somewhere.
Thank you. Where was I supposed to throw that again?
So let's just put it, I'm going to put mine maybe right under countdown, just somewhere with the rest of the properties that we have. So let's talk about date formatters. I think I've shown you this when we talked about dates originally. I'm just going to open up a playground. You can just watch me here. So if I have a date here, let now, print the date, let now. When I print this out, it doesn't look very pretty. Oh. There we go. This is kind of what gets printed out. It's not the nicest looking code. So what we can use is a date formatter, and it will literally format the date in the way that we specify. So in this case, what we're doing is we're putting it in this specific format, and I'll show you where you can kind of learn more about this. But it would put it in this specific format from, you know, this not fantastic looking date to exactly the way that we want it. So what I can do is I can say, let formatted time equal, and I'm just going to use that date formatter. There's the string from date, and so this date formatter is cool because it lets you convert a date into a nice looking string, but you can also have it go backwards where you give it a string and it will turn it into a date from that string, which is pretty cool, although we're not using that particularly today. But if I instead ask it, hey, I'm going to give you this time, which represents now, can you put it in this exact format that I specify? And if I print the formatted time, it looks exactly like I want it to. And the cool part here is you can mess around with this format here to get, you know, different things. So I could do like year, not that this really makes sense, but you know, 2020 or whatever, like you can just kind of play around with the date format. There is this really cool nsdateformatter.com. I'll send you all that you can mess around with. And this will give you all of these strings and you can just pass these in. So if you want, you know, this specific format here, just paste that into the date format here and it will print it out in that exact way. So really cool tool. There are a few built-in, I guess they call them styles, but as far as really granular control over the format of the date, you would use, you know, all of these different characters here. So that's all we're doing here with the date format is we're saying, hey, let's take a date that doesn't necessarily look super pretty and let's put it in this exact format so that we can display it like it shows here. Any questions on date formatters?
Why did we need a time zone?
Yeah, so as far as the time zone goes, if you look, actually, let me pull this back to what we had before. For me, it's 12 o'clock, 12:04, but over here it says that it's actually 6:04 because I'm 6 hours behind, essentially. So it's using, or we're setting it to be using Greenwich Mean Time. So the time zone is, so if I were to not do that, it would then say 12:04 like that. That's just a way to sort of set it so that we get a good amount of time here. To be honest, it's not going to matter a ton, but what we're actually going to end up doing is we're going to do like the, well, I'll show you. Hold that thought, and then when we write this function, I think it'll be clear, or the next two functions rather. So let's go into that string from duration function, and all we need to do is we're going to say let date equal. We just need to, in order to use the date formatter, this duration, which is just an amount of seconds, has to be in the format of a date to begin with. So we're just going to create a new date here. And we have a few options. If we just open and close parentheses, we can't really give it that duration, which is how long we want it to run for. So that doesn't quite work. If we use any of these though, this time interval since 1970, time interval since reference date, and time interval since now, these should all work. Although Actually, I don't think time interval since now will work. What we're going to use is the time since reference date, or you could actually use 1970 and it would work the same. You'll talk more about these in Unit 2 when you get to networking. Like January 1st, 1970 is a very common sort of starting point, sort of cross-platform for people to use. For example, if you fetch anything from you know, a server somewhere using a REST API or whatever, it tends to be in the format of an amount of seconds since 1970. It's just a common way of doing things. And then another one is this reference date, which is January 1st, 2001, kind of the same thing.
Is it bad to want to ask why 1970?
I have no clue. I think it was probably just early enough that there would never really be much of anything happening before then as far as the world of computing goes, but I could be wrong.
I'm almost 100% positive that it's because it's the decade in which it was done, and that was first done with Unix shells, and that was in the 1970s, and that was like the last decade flag before that.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So there was an iPhone bug where if you there was an app that got released that crashed a bunch of people's phones because it set the system time to like reset the epoch, and it would just like completely crash the OS.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think it's called a iOS epoch something.
I'll have to look that up. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I'll look it up and send a link. It's really interesting how that works.
Yeah.
Tom Scott over on Computer File on YouTube did a big video about the epoch bug. It's pretty neat.
Cool. I'll check it out. So we'll just use the reference date because it really doesn't matter. The biggest thing here is that we start at midnight, essentially 0000. So then what we're going to do is we're going to add our duration onto that. So if it's 5 minutes, it will be 12:05, but it will look like this. So when we format it, we get a nice clean looking sort of amount of seconds here that would be 5:01. That would match. If we did time interval since now, it would be like, again, like we see here, it would just add on 5 minutes to now, and that's not actually quite going to be what the timer should show. So we use time interval since reference date, and then we'll pass in that duration. So it'll be something, like 0:05:01 or something like that, more or less. And then we need to actually create that string here. So we'll say we can actually just do return our date formatter dot string from that date. And maybe I'll put that comment right here. So now that we have that, we can use this update views function. And this is really kind of like the key to everything. This is how we're going to make everything look the way that it should, depending on the current state of our countdown. So as an example, when the countdown is running, we want to do something. When the countdown finishes, we want to do something else, which in this case would be to show our alert controller when we get to the end. And then when it's reset, we can just put it back to a specific time. So let's do that. Let's say we're going to maybe use a switch statement, probably just because it's going to be the cleanest thing that we can do as far as our conditional logic here goes. Let's switch on the countdown state. Remember that countdown state, and you can just watch me here, you don't have to follow me, is just this, whether it's started, finished, or reset in the countdown. And it's kind of keeping track of that, but at any time we can see, hey, have you started? Or in other words, is it running? Has it finished? Has it been reset? And we want to do something depending on the state. So started, for that case, we'll start with that one. If the countdown is running, what do we want to change visually on the screen for the user to see? Or what does the user expect to see if they hit the start button and it's running?
The timer counting down.
Yeah, counting down. So we probably should change this label's text to actually count down or show the current time remaining. So we can say we have that time label outlet at the top, and we'll say dot text equals, and then we'll just use this string from duration function that we just made to grab that. So we'll say string from, and we'll do our countdown, it's time remaining. So the countdown knows how much time it has left, so we'll just ask it for that and turn that into a string so that it can be displayed on our time label. So as it's counting down, it will actually show the time remaining, assuming that we're calling this function. And something else that's probably a good idea to do is we can actually make it so that they can't start a new timer as one's already running. They have to reset the timer before they can start a new one. Or, you know, there's multiple ways that you could kind of set this up, but I'm gonna say, I don't want to let them hit the start button again until it's either finished or you reset. So what we can do is we can actually disable the interaction with the button itself. And it's start button dot is enabled equals false. And in doing that, it will start everything, and that's fine. However, it won't let me, you know, continually, like if I keep hitting start here, it won't let me start up 20 timers, and that can lead to some kind of weird behavior, especially with the label. I can kind of show you that if we have, well, we don't really have too much time. We're already over time. But if you're curious, I can talk to you about it later. Okay, what do we want to see when we've finished? Aside from showing the alert, because we'll do that in a different place, but maybe what should the label look like if it's finished?
Zeros.
In seconds you have selected.
Yeah, it's zeros. And sorry, what did someone say about selected?
How many minutes and seconds you have selected?
Yeah, so we could definitely do that. I think that's probably more for reset, but yes, that's definitely a good guess. So there's an issue here, and I can kind of show you that if I don't have this, oh, let me put a break in here. If we don't set that to zeros, like you're saying, you can actually run into this weird thing where, because of the way that the timer is working, it could not actually show zeros here when you finish. Could not update back to zeros. There we go. So I got 0.02 and it just sticks there. So instead, we're just going to kind of fudge it a little bit and just say, hey, let's put our time label, its text, just straight to 0. So we can just use that string from time interval. I'm just going to put 0 here. There's no time remaining. And then we know that it will always go to 0, even if there hasn't quite been that 0.03 seconds to cycle through and, you know, actually correctly update it. It was just barely too short there.
Since the user can't ever select anything outside of seconds, if you made that fire at 0.02 seconds instead of 0.03, it would run down the clock every time.
Yeah, you're right. And then for the reset, we'll do exactly what Cameron, let's see, it was Cameron that suggested this, which is we'll just set the time label's text back to whatever's, you know, the current duration. So if I, you know, hit reset here, I should probably have this go back to, you know, 2 seconds or whatever I already had selected. So we can just ask, hey, countdown, can you put this back to your duration, your kind of original starting point, in a sense.
In the case.finished and .reset, since we disable the start button, do we need to re-enable it?
Exactly, yes. So let's do that. Either way, we need to make it so that they can actually hit the start button again, or else that would be a bad user experience. They can, it's like a one-off. They can only use the start button one time. So let's say start button is enabled equals true for both finished and reset here. That's exactly right. So here's the thing. We've made this function, but we haven't quite called it anywhere. What I want to do is, well, just watch me here. In my countdown, if we look at the timer, we've seen that it's getting fired every 0.03 seconds. And the block or the function that's running is this update timer. If we look at that, this has those two delegate methods that we looked at earlier, which is the countdown did update and the countdown did finish. And so what we could do is just run over to those methods that will get called in our view controller. Our view controller is going to be this delegate here. And that's probably where we should update the views so that every time the countdown updates, it shows the new time, even if it's very, very quickly, many times a second. So if we scroll down here, there is this final extension here, or it's rather the first extension. So we have this countdown did update, so we can call update views here. And we also have the countdown did finish, so we can make sure that it doesn't, again, kind of catch on that last 0.02 or so seconds. And also in the countdown did finish, when the countdown finishes, what else do we want to do? What do we want to have show up?
Show the alert.
Alert, yeah.
Yeah, let's also show the alert right here as well. Perfect. I know there are a lot of moving parts to this, and I hope it's not super overwhelming for you. I think this is more, again, I tried to kind of separate out each part into, this is a timer, this is an alert, and this is a picker view, and now we're kind of putting it all together. I hope on a conceptual level, you don't feel like those as individual parts are too hard. Wiring everything up is where I think a little bit more complexity comes in, though. Okay, so there's one thing that we, well, a couple of things we need to do. One thing is specifically kind of related to to this stuff that we need to do still. Wondering if anyone can catch it. It's not necessarily in here, but it's related to this. How do these functions get called? Whoops, don't want to quit.
Do we need to set the delegate?
We do need to set the delegate, yep. That's perfect. So let's just jump back up to the view did load, and we'll say countdown.delegate, oops, delegate equals self. Otherwise, those functions would never actually run. Okay, real quick, there's no real sort of delegate method to trigger the update views specifically for this reset here. So, oh, that was weird. Let's also call update views in our reset button tapped so that it can actually, you know, put this back to whatever I've selected here. Let's run this here and see what we get. We're almost done. We have a couple UI tweaks to fix, but functionally it should be there. So what do we see that's not happening here?
It's not updating as we select different numbers.
Yeah. What's interesting though is if I hit start here, it does start counting down from 5 minutes, but as we select it, it doesn't do anything. So where do we also need to maybe call that update views function? When do we know when we select a new row in our picker view?
In the did select row function in the UIPickerView delegate extension.
Perfect, yeah. It should be this last function at the bottom here. So after we set that duration to something else, let's just say, go ahead and update the views so that it actually will show that. So now as I move this around, it should update. So that's good. Let's start this timer here. This looks a little bit weird. It's kind of jumping around. Does anyone know off the top of their head why this is happening? I'm not necessarily expecting anyone to. This is kind of an esoteric thing.
Is it the relative size of the numbers, like in their font list, is unconstrained, and it's actually breaking the constraints of that label?
So you're on the right track. It's not necessarily breaking the constraints, but what's happening is the label is trying to fill the size of the full width of the label with this text, and so it's slightly modifying the font size. The problem here is if we look for example, at this number 1, it's about that large. But then if we look at the number 10, for example, it's a lot wider. And so as these numbers are different, they need more space depending on what the number is, right? That makes sense. And 0 is much wider than a 1 is. So in order to fix that, we have what are called monospaced fonts, where every character is always the same width, no matter kind of how large the character within it is. There's just sort of equal spacing. So if we want to use that, we can just jump into the muted load, for example, again, and say that we specifically want this label to use a monospaced font. And there's actually one built in. So we're going to say time label dot font, and there's actually a UI font object. I don't actually know if it's a class or struct. It's a class. So we're going to say equals UI font dot monospaced digit system font of size . And then you can choose the font size. What I'm going to do is just ask the time label's original font for its same size. So I'm just going to say time label dot font dot, let's see, it's point size. And then for the way you could do bold, medium, regular, I'm just going to do medium, a little more kind of dark than the normal, or kind of a little more chunky almost than regular would be, but not quite bold. And in doing that, now everything takes up the same amount of space, regardless of if it's a 1 or not. So as I move this, as I move this around, the 1 and the 0 have the same amount of space. So it doesn't kind of try to resize itself there. And I'm trying to hit the start button here. Nothing's happening because we've disabled it, so that's good. If I hit reset, then we enable it again and I can start it over. And let's just, let's double check and make sure that our alert works. Yep. That looks good. The final thing that we haven't done from the solution is make it kind of squished in a little bit more. We see that this is kind of all closer together. This is a part of that UIPickerView delegate protocol. So we have row height for components, so you can literally say how tall you want these to be, each of these individual rows. So what this would really look like is these little separators here would just be higher, and these would have a little bit more space. And then there's also width for components. So you could even individually say, maybe I don't need a ton of room for these components, but I want, a lot more space for the min for whatever reason or whatever. So, or you can make them all the same, but it's up to you. So if we wanted to do that, we could just jump back down to our UIPickerView delegate method and say width for component. And then you can mess around with this. I think we did 50 for the solution, but if you want to make this really small, you could probably do 20. I don't know if it's actually going to cut things off. Yeah, it will. 50 would look good though. And so it just gives 50 points of space to each individual component here. Or you could say, for the even components, make it 50. For the odd ones, make it 100. For 0, make it 50. I mean, you can go as kind of complex as you want here. Okay, final questions or comments here?
Can you show me the time label.font code again?
Yes.
Mine is crashing.
Yours is crashing.
Yes. And I can screen share today.
You can?
Yeah, I
just
put it on my MacBook today.
Awesome. Okay, so for anyone that is done, that's everything I have. So if you don't have any questions or anything, feel free to head out to lunch. Thanks for sticking around for a little more time, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Yes, I will definitely send a zip file. Okay, can you run? Yeah, okay. So can you scroll up to the...
There we go. Now it aborted on me.
Can you scroll up to the top of these numbers down here? And then there's going to be a paragraph. Yep, right there. Okay, so you're just using a bad index. So my assumption is probably somewhere in like the countdown picker data or something, or maybe one of the delegate methods at the bottom. Let's see, component, row, that's good, component. Can you scroll up to the top of the, yep, right there, or down a little bit? Oh, right here. That should be component 2. Let's see, 0, 1, 2, yeah. So we just want to grab that third component, not an 8th one that doesn't quite exist.
Okay. It succeeded.
It's 11:30.
It's 11:30.
There we go.
Is it working?
Works. Yes, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, my start and reset aren't working.
Okay, yeah, let's take a look.
All right. Share. All right, can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. All right. So see when I click on the buttons here, nothing's happening.
Happens. Okay. Let's oh, okay. So if you can you scroll down a little bit into your viewed load? Yeah, right there. So you've just got the let me grab the arrow here. You're setting the countdown picker delegate twice. That should just be countdown.delegate equals self. So just pull
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yep. Let's try that. We should be good now. Awesome.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Any other questions? Israel, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry. I want to share my screen. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Okay. I'm not getting what I need to. Let me see. Let me show you. Oh. The button here, I didn't get it proper. The last thing you talk about at the last part there.
Yeah, so it looks like you just need to, just delete that line that you're on right now.
Okay.
And then hit enter. So put your cursor right here and then hit enter. And then, yeah, let's see, you have the did. So that should be, so start, you've got title for row, did select row. Okay, start typing did select row.
Did select.
Keep going, select. Yep, that second one, or yep, the first one right there. Just hit enter right there. Perfect. And then we're going to say countdown dot duration. Or sorry, no, I apologize, right here.
Okay.
Countdown dot duration equals duration. Perfect. Yeah, you got it. And then on the next line here, let's just hit enter right after that line.
Yeah.
And then, yep, right there. And then call update views.
Okay.
Perfect. And that should get that part working. Let's see. Oh, I see. You've just kind of swapped these. So right here, delete these two lines.
This.
Yep.
Okay.
And then return 50 there. Yep.
50.
Now it should stop yelling at you there. Oh, let's see, with for component. And... Oh, I see what you've done. Let's see, return. So right here at that arrow, put int, or sorry, do CG float. Yep, right there. Hit enter on that one. There we go. Let's see if that stops yelling at you. Okay, good. Okay, it looks like you've got quite a few errors that I can kind of see over here. I just pasted the solution project in the iOS 16 channel. So you can take a look at that and just grab what you've missed from there.
Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Is there any mistake I'm making here, please, before you go?
Sorry, what?
Is there any mistake I'm making here before you go? I don't want to know because I know I will check it, but I don't want to check something. Is there any mistake I'm making here?
You're missing a parenthesis right here at the end.
Parenthesis?
Yep. And so it's yelling at you at the next line, but it's coming right there. So that should go away then.
Okay.
So if you take a look at the project that I just sent in the iOS 16 channel, you should be able to see what you've got just slightly missing, in here, and all of these different errors, and get those fixed up quickly. Does that sound okay?
Thank you.
All right. All right, then we'll call it good. Thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you later. See ya.